Ringo Starr was the drummer with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and they'd got to know him in Hamburg. 6 months earlier, Ringo had sat in with the Beatles for a couple of gigs when Pete had been ill, and they'd got on brilliantly with him. When they heard he'd left Rory's band, they decided to offer him a job. Another band offered him a job at the same time, but the Beatles were paying more and had a record contract. So Ringo said yes to them, and that was it. He was in, the only condition being that he had to brush his hair down like theirs. He said he would. For the next couple of weeks, the boys had to face Pete's furious fans wherever they went. His moody style had attracted a big following, and the girls couldn't understand why he'd been dumped. It was front-page news in Merseybeat, and the boys were heckled and jeered several times. But they stuck it out, and gradually, as audiences got used to the new face, the fuss died down. While all this was going on, I had only half an eye on what they were doing because I was contemplating my own future. In July, I discovered first that I had failed one of my final exams, and second, that I was pregnant. I had to decide whether to retake the exam or to give up on becoming an art teacher. Under any other circumstance, this decision would have occupied all my thoughts for days to come, but the discovery that I was pregnant wiped everything else out of my mind. I sat alone in my bedsit, crying and railing against life, dreading the shame of telling my mother, who was about to visit me from Canada, and wondering how John would react. I expected him to take it badly, and before I told him, I made up my mind that I'd cope alone. I knew I couldn't face an abortion, which in any case would be hard to come by and dangerous. I was going to face the consequences and bring up the baby on my own if I had to, although that would have made me a social outcast. Eventually I plucked up all my courage and told John. As the news sank in, he went pale, and I saw fear in his eyes. For a couple of minutes we were both silent. I watched him as I waited for a response. Would he walk out on me? Then he spoke. There's only one thing for it, Cyn. We'll have to get married. I asked him whether he meant it. I told him he didn't have to marry me, that I was prepared to manage on my own, but he was insistent. Neither of us planned to have a baby, Cyn, but I love you and I'm not going to leave you now. The next day John told Brian, who asked him to think carefully, and told him he didn't have to go through with it. No doubt Brian was thinking of the future of the group, who'd just got their first recording contract. I'm sure he felt that it would be more appealing to the fans if the boys were all single. But John insisted he wanted to marry me, and Brian agreed to help. He got an emergency license and booked the register office for the first available date. John's next task was the one he dreaded. Mimi, predictably, was furious when she heard the news. She screamed, raged, and threatened never to speak to him again if he went ahead with it. Julia, John's sister, was 16 at the time, and she was there. Later she told me that John had stood up to Mimi. "You don't understand, Mimi. I love Cyn. I want to marry her." Mimi certainly didn't understand. She accused me of planning the whole thing to trap John and made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with the wedding. I had a much easier time with my mother. Even then I was so afraid that she would be disappointed in me that it was not until the last day of her visit that I found the courage to tell her. She was staying with my brother Tony and I went to see her the night before she sailed back to Canada. When I told her about my pregnancy, her only concern was for me. She felt terrible that she was leaving the next day and couldn't stay to look after me, but she put her arms around me, told me that we all make mistakes and that it would turn out all right in the end. The next day, Tony, his wife Marjorie, and I went with Mum to the ship. As we said our last goodbyes, and she waved to us from the railing, I collapsed in tears and sobbed so hard that Tony and Marjorie had to practically carry me home. I wanted Mum to be with me so badly, but I had to manage without her. The next day, I married John. Our wedding was an odd mixture of the comically funny and the downright bizarre. Both John and I were so stunned by the suddenness with which our lives and relationship were changing that the day felt unreal. It was as if we were watching a film, yet taking part in it at the same time. Many commentators on John's life have said that John would never have married me if I hadn't been pregnant. In the film Backbeat, I was portrayed as a clingy, dim little girlfriend in a headscarf. Totally wrong, of course. Quite apart from anything else, I never wore a headscarf. It's hard to see our relationship given that untruthful twist. Both John and I believed we'd marry one day, and so did most people who knew us then. Phil used to say we were joined at the hip and that John was besotted with me. My pregnancy changed our plans, but not our intentions or feelings for each other. The wedding was all arranged so fast that we had barely time to think. Once the decision had been made, it was booked for a couple of weeks later, on August the 23rd. The wedding was booked for late in the morning at the Mount Pleasant Register office, and Brian, who proved himself a true friend and far more than just John's manager, arranged to pick me up from my bedsit and drive me there. That morning I got ready on my own. I'd have loved Phil to be with me, but she was away on holiday. I couldn't afford a new outfit, so I wore my best purple and black check two-piece suit with a frilly high-necked white blouse that Astrid had given me. I put my hair up in a French pleat, added black shoes, a black bag, touch of pink lipstick, and I was ready. Brian arrived dapper in a pinstriped suit and escorted me to his chauffeur-driven car. He looked so smart, and the glamorous car made me feel special. He was kind to me on the journey, soothing my nerves and telling me I looked lovely. The weather was awful. It might have been August, but the sky was overcast and grey, and it looked as though it would rain at any moment. I prayed it wouldn't, at least until I'd got into the registry office, because I didn't have an umbrella. When we arrived, John, Paul and George were pacing about in the waiting room. They were all alarmingly formal, in black suits with white shirts and white ties, the only smart outfits they had. George and Paul had made a big effort to look the part and clearly felt it was their role to support John, who was sitting between them, white-faced. I was touched by the effort they'd made, although their clothes would have been more in keeping with a funeral, and so would their expressions. All three were horribly nervous. When I came in, John leapt to his feet to hug and kiss me and tell me I looked beautiful. Someone made a crack about the boys' suits, which broke the ice. We all started to giggle. My brother Tony and his wife Marjorie arrived next, hurrying in at the last minute because they had to come in their lunch hour. Tony was there to represent our family, and he played the big brother to perfection, putting an arm round me protectively. I know John would have loved someone to be there from his family, but Mimi had put paid to that. Moments later, we were ushered into the registry office, where the registrar, a dour, solemn man, was waiting for us. As John and I stood in front of him, preparing for our vows, the whole thing took a ludicrously comical turn. A workman in the backyard of the building opposite started up a pneumatic drill, and we stared at each other in disbelief. The noise was ear-splitting. Clearly the man wasn't going to stop, so we had no choice but to carry on. There was another comic moment when the registrar asked the groom to step forward, and George did so, but the registrar saw nothing funny in either the drilling or George's joke, so we all struggled to keep our faces straight. John and I leaned forward, straining to hear the registrar and shouting our responses. Paul, Tony and Marjorie signed the register as our witnesses, and a couple of minutes later we were outside the room. We all burst out laughing, overwhelmed by relief that it was over. Outside the rain was bucketing down. We ran along the street, laughing at the madness of it all, and burst into Reese's Cafe, where we had to queue for the set lunch of soup, chicken and trifle. Reese's had no license, so when we finally got a table, we toasted ourselves with water. But we didn't care. We were on a high, and a full church wedding with all the extras couldn't have made me happier. And despite the anxiety I knew he felt, John wore a look of pride and pleasure that touched me. It was as though something had changed in him. He was a married man now, soon to be a father, and he liked it.